By now, we've looked at the ways in which the national government's power has grown compared to what it was like in the 1780s and the 1800s. Now we want to change our focus and look at the separation of powers, which has helped to keep the government from becoming too powerful. So today we're going to explain what separation of powers exist in the Constitution, and that way we'll be able to explain why the separation of powers is necessary and how it keeps the government from becoming too powerful. Now, before we get into the separation of powers, the first thing we're going to do is just run through some straight vocabulary that's just about the different types of powers in the Constitution so that we're all clear on what these words mean. So first would be expressed powers. Expressed powers are actually written in the words of the Constitution. That means we're mostly going to find express powers in Article 1 and Article 2 because that's what gives the Congress and President powers. So express powers, the actual words of the Constitution. For example, Congress can levy taxes or the President can negotiate treaties. Those are the words of the Constitution, so they are expressed powers. Next would be implied powers. These are suggested by the express powers. So the words of the Constitution suggest that these additional powers exist. These powers we've talked about, they come from the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution. So because Congress has the expressed power to deal with naturalization laws, that suggests that they can limit immigration. Because the president has the express power that he is commander-in-chief, that suggests that he can use the army to help clean up a natural disaster. None of these words are in the Constitution, but they are suggested or implied by the words that are in the Constitution. And then next we have inherent powers, and these are a form of implied powers. These are powers that are suggested just because the United States is a government. So in other words, these are things that all governments can do. So they didn't bother adding these words to the Constitution. All governments can do this. All governments can punish people for committing crimes. So of course the United States government can do that. Next, we might see the word delegated. A delegated power is a power that is given to the national government by the Constitution. It is the same as express power, but sometimes you will see the word delegated used instead. Similarly, we have enumerated powers, and these are the same. They are given to the national government by the words of the Constitution. They are the same as express powers. When we think about enumerated powers, think about a list of powers. And so I would say that these are mostly found in Article 1, Section 8, the powers of Congress. We're going to talk about these more when we get to federalism, but we also have exclusive powers, which would mean only the national government has these powers. We have reserved powers, which means only the state governments have these powers. And we have concurrent powers, which means both the national government and the state governments have these powers at the same time. Moving on, we want to look at the separation of powers that the Constitution designs. Now, you guys are going to have to be able to articulate this. You're going to have to be able to express what that means without just saying that the powers are separated. So we're going to look into what that means today. So when I say that there's a separation of powers, what I mean is that the national government's powers are divided between three different branches of government. Not only are the powers divided, but different people work in those branches and they have different roles in our policy-making process. So a person cannot be the president and a member of the court at the same time. People either belong to the legislative branch where they make the law, or they belong to the executive branch where they carry out the policy, or they belong to the judicial branch where they interpret the policy. But that's what makes our branches separate and co-equal branches. We have different people in the different branches of government, and they have different roles in the policy-making process. So separation of powers is an idea that we talked about when we were talking about the Enlightenment. This comes from Montesquieu. This is an idea that the separation of the lawmaking and the implementing of the law is important. So we want separate legislative and executive branches. And that way we force the branches to work together to accomplish their policy goals. If they're working together, then it's going to require a degree of compromise, and the policies that get made are going to be more moderate or in the middle of what the lawmakers would do if they had the power to do whatever they wanted. And this is probably a better outcome for us as people. It's also up to the branches to monitor each other and make sure that each other is exercising its own role properly. And that's why we'll get into checks and balances, but each branch has the ability to ensure that the other branches are acting the way that they're supposed to act. We're going to talk about this paper a lot more later when we look at the Federalist Papers, but the separation of powers is explained by James Madison in Federalist number 51. His most famous quote from this is, "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition." And what we mean there is that each branch is going to be full of the kind of people who are ambitious and want power for themselves. The kind of people who run for president are ambitious people, and they don't let people like trample all over their roles or their rights and their powers. The same is true of anyone who runs for Congress. And so if we have a government full of ambitious people who protect their own powers and protect their own rights and responsibilities, then these branches are going to struggle for power with each other. And if they struggle for power with each other, then we're going to have a government with more limited powers that's not going to be working together to oppress us.